Ninamani, Ngacho Yungadaya, Yakunudaya, thank you very much, Sophie. It's very impressive. Good afternoon, honoured guests, dignitaries. I acknowledge the unceded sovereignty of my peoples, the Kaurna. I think that it's a real important day today for what our discussions will be around about public schooling. Education inequality in public schooling has a geography and an architecture. Education and equality in public schooling has a ubiquity and antiquity. A national curriculum in a public school, in a settler society like Australia, is always a compromise. Especially in a country like Australia that's struggling with amnesia about its First Nations peoples. And in this era of knowledge hierarchies, we must ask the question as leaders of our public schools, whether we've got the balance right for all learners to succeed, and particularly once they succeed, to reduce disparity. I think that's a fundamental goal of what a public school should be. It is right, my colleagues and friends, to challenge in these challenging times, to continue the good work of implementing a culturally responsive school towards educational equality. How, as leaders then, are we to reconceptualise the role of the public school principle, to be responsive in an age of AI, in an age of climate change, and to engage all learners? I'd like to thank the conference organisers for bestowing the great honour to deliver the first Dr Alice Rigney Oration on public education and its future. There are few Australians who have shown us the path towards equality in public education than School Principal Alice Rigney, who sat in the very chair that you're sitting in all those years ago. A special thanks to Sophie, particularly President Eva Cannistori, who was my mentor at school, actually, during my teaching prac. So honoured to be here today with you. I've always looked up to you, and I've always constantly what would Eva do in this situation? Jane Heath, Chief Executive, thank you to you. Professor Westall, Professor Robert Haddam, colleague and friend, and Professor Dawson, the head of the Education Faculty at the UniSA. Alice Rigney, in early 1960, was the first in a group of Aboriginal people to work in the Education Department. In 1985, she was the first Aboriginal person to join the high administration ranks within the Education Department, so it's not that long ago. In 1986, that's when she became the first female Aboriginal school principal in South Australia, who co-founded the first urban school in Australia called the Kaurna Plains School. When my mother, Alice, the Aboriginal, was born in 1942 during the Second World War, she was not considered Australian citizen. She didn't have the right to vote. There were no Aboriginal urban schools. There was no Indigenous education. And there was not one single Aboriginal worker in the Education Department in South Australia. The Education Gazette in 1962 reported that Colonial Education Department was taking over the education of Aboriginal learners from the draconian missionary schools, and that it was to invoke homogeneity and the eradication of plurality. Raising serious concerns, Alice, the now school leader, sought to improve the system's capacity, and her reforms and philosophy included the following: public education as education of the public, for the public, and accountable to the public, for we the people. In actual fact, she used that slogan constantly. Others have used it in the past. Within a generation, she argued, she wanted to shift public education away from Aboriginal assimilation and failure. Lofty goals that we could attempt to try and do this within a generation. She also argued that for curriculum to be located locally, designed locally, and strongly connected to all children's life worlds that surrounded the school and upheld the aspirations of the parents and the community that surrounded the school. She recognised that there was a political struggle over the work of school principals and the need to wrestle it back from managerialism, compliance, and the never-ending chase of funding. She was quite concerned about her colleagues as principals that were dealing with narrow pedagogies, one-size-fits-all of teaching to the test. In no way do these take into consideration the experiences and strengths of students, and in no way do these speak to important social issues of our time, including the planet, economic inequality, cohesion and publicness. She was deeply concerned and wanted to illuminate the overwhelming stress, policy, conflict, and the struggle to hold on that continues to characterise the working lives of school principals, you, her colleagues. She rallied against one-size-fits-all. She believed all children were intelligent, capable and had rights, and are knowledge producers, not knowledge consumers. To build a public Aboriginal-led school was her goal, but it was never to be the only one in the state. She wanted to fix existing schools to be responsive to children's difference as an asset to learning instead of ignoring them. McGill and Whitehead's work on research on Alice's work laid bare the problems of public schools and that we must do better. Today, we're asking similar questions, my colleagues, as leaders of our public schools, as defenders of the public school child and their rights. How are public schools and the work of their school principals constituted in these more challenging times? What is the purpose of public school and who benefits? In wrestling back our profession as principals of public schools, wrestling back our school leadership, what opportunities exist for us to accelerate, amplify, and drive impact towards a responsive school that meets all the needs of children? The idea of a public education sees education as an important dimension of the common good and as an important institution in securing the common good, where the child can learn about their rights and their participation of the common good. And in contrast, education philosopher Gert Biesta's findings reveal a significant body of evidence documenting the decline of public education globally. Part of this voluminous literature highlights what he calls the inner and outer erosion of public education in modern times. The inner erosion is the relentless pressure to perform in compliance in alleged indicators of quality, such as league tables, which are taken as definition of quality, which then becomes pursued for their own sake rather than the sake of good education itself. These literally consume the principal's role, according to Gert Biesta. And another part of the literature focuses on the outer erosion of public school in funding. Julie Hare of the Financial Review reported just last week that underfunding of public schools fuels the achievement gap. She goes on to argue that just 1.3% of public schools receive their full funding from the Commonwealth, compared with 100% of independent schools. Without Commonwealth support, according to a Deakin University research by Rowe and DiGiorgio, in their interviews with school principals, claimed that the school principals saw their role as becoming grant chasers and revenue raisers instead of pedagogues. Biesta's point is that both inner and outer erosion of public education tends to disconnect education from the publics it should serve. Teacher shortage is known for the way in which our workforce is seeking better wage and better conditions. So today, we're talking about, in the time that I have left, the same old story, the legacy that I'm following, Dr. Alice Rigney. Cultural responsive pedagogies and multiliteracies are critical to public good, are critical to public schooling. A large body of evidence shows the centrality of engagement and improvement in learning are the children's funds of knowledge when they're connected to an inclusive curriculum and a multiliteracy program. We are talking today about schooling and literacy as a social practice that's underpinned by proven scientific social cultural theories of literacy learning that date far back to the rigorous work of Vygotsky and Dewey. But more importantly goes back to Moll, Rogoff, Comer, Schifflin. They all situate bilingual and multicultural literacies in a socio-cultural historical context, which is the theme of your conference here today. Now, this is also reaffirmed in the new disciplines of new literacy studies and the International Literacies Association and the National Council of Teachers of English. Today, what I wanted to truly focus on in the back end of my program is that we will discuss literacy, public schooling, as a social practice and not necessarily an isolated individual practice, but one that operates from within a community of readers, writers, speakers, and listeners, where learners are not seen as passive, compliant, docile consumers of education, but are seen as active, critical, and creative users of their own languages and contexts, code and text, as well as those of Australia's settler grammar. In other words, the conceptual framework of my research and those of my colleagues and those of my university, through a framework of cultural responsive pedagogies and public schooling, draws upon this volume of archive of the social cultural literacy learning approach that advocates that school principals and teacher practices to validate, affirm, build and bridge the voices, cultural and linguistic intelligences or funds of knowledge brought to school from home by the super diverse learner that is now the new normal inside the public school. Today, I want to talk with you about not so much why my research team, but more of what we are doing, because I believe both in the idea of public school and the public school principle. I believe in your organisation's fundamental goals, and that is that cultural, cognitive development, literacy in the public school, social enactment are proving mutually facilitative and inseparable. The evidence at the moment is that our public schools has not lived up to the expectations of solving education inequality. And I believe we agree, my friends and colleagues, on the purpose of why we're here together today. We believe that an inclusive education should diminish inequality and inequity. And in doing so, we uphold Aboriginal and super diverse learner voices and their literacy aspirations. I congratulate the association for having this as their objective, And we know if we don't have a focus on improving achievement and overcoming inequality and disparity, it has detrimental effects on health, income, employment, and social cohesion of a society. It is right that this be urgent focus of our attention. And I'm very impressed with this, our association and having voiced the Steely goal. And my congratulations to the current president for pursuing this. The other purpose of why we're here together is that we agree, rather than seeing the learner as feeble, weak and needy, instead we view the child literacy learner as citizen, as competent subject and as the possessor of rights, and that the challenge is not to recreate in our public schools the literacy wars or the math wars, the numeracy wars, or the curriculum wars. But as my good friend Sue Nichols, Professor Sue Nichols suggests in her latest book, our task as the principal of a public school is to negotiate and traverse old literacies with new literacies, new curricula, new attempts to try and turn the child on to digital learning, to create schools that enable all learners to acquire a standard that, yes, will support them to achieve academically, but more importantly, one that is responsive and respectful of all children as culturally situated. Another purpose of why we're here today is we agree on the implication of public school curriculum and its policy for good, and those policies that do great harm, particularly to multilingual societies, particularly when they create official and unofficial family literacy practices, or when public school curriculum or policy or pedagogy subscribe to knowledge hierarchies by constructing centre and peripheral formal learning. Our aim is shared here today, is privileging diverse literacies, multi-world competencies to assist all children to navigate a global world. And if there's one central reason to be here today, it's to agree on the need to create schools that are able, as Zimbalist puts it, to host difference. Hosting, as you host a dinner party at your house, you want all the guests to bring something and you want to host them in a really respectful way. So this notion that I want to plant into Zimbalist's today is the school principal as host of difference. As a host, we see the uniqueness that each of our guests bring, all of their humanness, and we create the context that looks like their contexts. We create the difference that looks like their difference. And we learn to dialogue and enrich in exactly the same terminologies that our schools should reflect from their home and our community. Yet in education, we are at a crossroad. In a world of 7 billion people, UNESCO data shows 250 million students are out of school globally. Harder to grasp is what exclusion looks like in predictions of a world with 10 billion people in 2050. 10 billion people in 2050, what should public schooling look like with that amount of volume of people on the world and pressure on resources? In Australia, gaps in school inclusion and quality and delivery for all children, but specifically for our First Nations children, are widening, not closing. This is in spite of 2 decades of standardised testing and Australian curriculum for people like me who were at the table that invented it. Because we thought that it would make a difference, solve the tyranny of distance, and that it would fix education for all. So here are the data that we currently see, and you would look at the date that I've put up here. This was the date, the national curriculum and standardised testing has been in for 10 years. And I put up the 2009 statistics because My point is here, they haven't changed. We have made no gain. So you also see what we're calling here the pedagogies of enactment. You can see my statement at the start that education inequality has a geography, and the further you live out, the further you have a schooling system that is still struggling to meet the expected goals of what the public good should be. You're supposed to be seeing green here in terms of Indigenous Year 3 students at above the national minimum standard in reading. And despite some of the interior Aboriginal groups speaking 3 languages, they're still tested in NAPLAN as if they're first language speakers of English. We can see the geography enactment in colour. This is interesting, Wilkinson and Pickett's, what is called the spirit level. And what you're seeing here, my colleagues, is health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. And so you see the United States right up the top, Portugal, UK, where income and living conditions are at their worst, are at their greatest. And you can see all of the high influencing education countries down the bottom who are closing the gap on income inequality and health and social indexes. So we know that when we don't have good education, or public education and public schooling, we have poor life expectancy, we have poor math and literacies, we have really low infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, and so on, obesity. And so we're very clear about why the need for us to ask this question of the purpose of public schooling and to wrestle back our profession as leaders of public schooling. So the key question then is, I just want to then conclude with some findings of what a culturally responsive school and a cultural responsive leadership and a culturally responsive workforce looks like in a public school, in which we've been working now for the last decade with Professor Haddam, and we've had 2 major prestigious Australian Research Council grants. We've worked closely with the South Australian Education Department, and we were talking about these ideas, and I just want to quickly show you the hypothesis for a culturally responsive school was from my earlier work in the 1990s around epistemologies and educational pluralism. Then we were trying to look at that stage, what were the enablers for diverse students to achieve academically by teacher pedagogy and their leadership that connect students' cultural and linguistic intelligences to the curriculum? How can we educate a workforce to do that more efficiently, scale it up? We were also interested, even back then, to try to overcome deficit views of diverse learners and also deficit views of the students had of teachers. We're wanting to really provocate the teacher as researcher to redesign their practices in a principle-led sandpit where the teachers could have an ongoing conversation about a teacher-led redesigning a professional learning community of their own practices. We've had ARC testing in over 20 schools in the early 2000s, and then the development of the model, the Australian model, which my colleagues and I have provocated, and that is culturally responsive pedagogies up to mid-2000s. So our ARC longitudinal cultural responsive teacher practice project, we investigated how principals can support teachers as researchers in action research to redesign their practices to become more culturally responsive to diverse Aboriginal and diverse students. we were looking at 15 schools, 40 teachers, 5 preschools, servicing something like about 500 students and 150 students. And the central questions were, how do leaders and educators develop learning opportunities for all by enacting a child-centred culture as asset approach to learning that acknowledges mandated literacy standards but begins to recognise and value the linguistic and cultural repertoire of knowledge that is linked to the community. Some of the data that we were using were clearly interviews, surveys, teacher action research, ethnographies, classroom observations. We documented teachers. We took copies of teachers' documentation about their assessment procedures and plans. We looked at school student learning improvement plans. We looked at the department's policy documentation. We also did video elicitation in some areas, in some earlier projects. But our project rationale went something like this, that we wanted to address the appalling school outcomes for Aboriginal learners, and we're also wanting to provocate that there is a new super diverse learner that's walking into class, and that they are the new normal, and that there is a high demand by teachers and principals to address this new need of this new super diverse learner. We were looking at what types of professional learning that could drive whole school reform, supported by the principal and led by teachers. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were appropriately looking at decolonisation or anti-deficit views. This notion of super diversity that I just want to talk to you really quickly about, this notion that almost 1 in 2 families have an overseas-born parent, and 1 in 4 Australians were born overseas, and that we are now in uncharted territories inside the public school. We no longer have the multicultural child in the early 1920s and 30s, but we still have multicultural policy parading as though it's fit for purpose. Our argument is, and our findings were, that we now have the super diverse learner. And we're using early work from Veritech, but we're now using Gufang Lee's work. And this view is the diversification of diversity. Super diversity has surpassed old traditional multiculturalism, and therefore new patterns of teaching are in urgent demand by schools. And this is what we found in our research. We found that most of our public school classrooms are mini United Nations, but more than just ethnicity, that they also have, unlike before, climate change refugees. This was never prevalent in old multiculturalism, which was just about the First Nation learner, the settler, and the immigrant. We need new vocabularies and new pedagogies to deal with the super diverse learner. And according to Gufang Lee, in her study across the globe, that this is also prevalent in places like the United States and in New Zealand. Some urban schools, according to her, sometimes have students from more than 100 language backgrounds, and these children now constitute 1/3 of public school students in the United States, and they often face multiple challenges of language acquisition, cultural adjustment, and content learning in the classroom that may not be experienced by their mainstream or locally born minority peers. So the key question is, even 10 years ago, we didn't have pedagogy or teacher resources to teach the wishes of a non-binary parent who wants a non-gendered, wants to have a non-gendered education for their child. So this is a conundrum for us when we are as leaders and we're trying to prepare our workforces in school when they have no resources to teach about a non-gendered childhood, because all of the children's books either talk about a male or a female. So we are in uncharted territory, And the key thing for us is when we see the super diverse learner, the definition is there's diversity, the diversification of diversity. So now we have Aboriginal learners who have one Aboriginal parent and has another parent as a Muslim. Either one of the parents could be from a climate change refugee, speaks 3 Indigenous languages as well as Arabic, and have a disability, and also are a digital immigrant. So the super diverse notions that we're using in our research is that we now have to see learners and the modern childhood as a growth that we've never seen before. The key question is, we can't address the super diverse learner with old multicultural pedagogies or policies. So what is cultural responsive pedagogies in the last 10 minutes that I have? Well, it's teaching through, we have adopted several, we've got our own, I've just put up Gay's work here, teaching to and through the students' personal cultural strengths, their intelligences and their prior knowledges. And so these biography or asset pedagogies that they're better known, my colleagues, how do we switch on to the new curriculum through these biography asset-rich pedagogies. So these super diverse students come to our schools now, who are the modern childhood, come to schools with funds of knowledge, and that it's up to the public school to build on these capabilities. Academic success will result. Gay has done lots of work. It's initially come from cultural responsive pedagogies done on African Americans and South Americans and Hispanic Americans in the United States, and we were the first research project in South Australia to bring it here to Australia. So we now have the model for Australia in the Australian context. Most of the pedagogical principles that we've looked at come from a range of intellectual giants, Moll, Gonzalez, Vygotsky, Dewey, Freire, Rinaldi, in terms of Malaguzzi and Reggio Emilia. So our 5 principles, when we give them to principals and schools to enact into their pedagogy as whole school approaches, we initially found that there were 50 types of principles across the globe. For the Australian context, we came up with 5, Professor Haddam and I, and that is that school and public school should provide high intellectual challenge. It should connect the content strongly to the student life worlds. It recognises cultural difference as a positive asset to learning, not an inhibitor. And it allows multimodal literacies and critical thinking. So the central point in terms of some of the statistics that you have seen before I go into the findings, that you saw that the statistics are stark, particularly around Indigenous peoples. But I just wanted to put this point in, that the results of the 2023 Indigenous voice, and there may be some international colleagues amongst us who may not know this, that the results of the 2023 Indigenous voice referendum saw 70% of Australians voted against the recognition of Aboriginal children's voices and their rightful place in the Australian Constitution. The age demographic of no reflects the teacher workforce of the country. And as literacy researchers and practitioners in our university, this leads us to ask, what is the Aboriginal child's place in our public school with no voice and who is invisible? What is the state of childhood in settler Australia? How can the public school restore the Aboriginal child's to take their rightful place as First Nations of Australia? What kind of Australia do we want to live in? And what does public schooling look like in this type of Australia? After a nation votes against an Aboriginal child's voice, What is the purpose of schooling? What is the purpose of a national curriculum or a literacy formulaic policy? Who's included, who is excluded? And more importantly, what are we going to, as leaders of schools, what are we going to do about it? The work that we were doing starts to ameliorate in the Australian nation of no. It starts to elevate voices, and that a culturally responsive pedagogy does allow the subaltern to speak, as what Spivak would say. And Spivak, Edward Said, who invokes Spivak's concepts, also says that the school principal as public intellectual must face the challenges of our time to pluralise school when all others are trying to homogenise them. This gives us new challenge to a world imaginary that's super diverse outside of our national border. How do we connect the super diverse learner inside our nation to those on the outside, which are now, the world has become smaller through the internet? In the time I have, I just want to finish off on the findings of what our research have shown. I want to just show you how teachers, principals, and the public school for the good might go about improving their educational outcome for Aboriginal and super diverse learners and contribute to a reduction in disparity. If super diverse learners are the new normal, and we argue that it is across the globe and in Australia, we then need to try and look at neurodivergent disabilities, class, gender, diverse, non-binary, climate refugees, digital diversity, war refugees, immigrants, Indigenous, native-born learners, and those of difference outside of our nation. Diversity in diversity, my colleagues, is our new challenge. When we invoked the 5 principles and we had of cultural responsive pedagogies, we worked closely alongside, my research team worked closely alongside the schools and the principals were making places in their curriculum teams for their teachers to lead learning on redesigning their pedagogies towards the super diverse learner. Here are some of the things that we found as in terms of our findings. The first findings that we found when we invoked this, our findings confirm the previous research that an inclusive curriculum and in a public school is not enough to reduce disparity. And we find this confirms the sort of the previous research by Freary, Boomer, Comer, Zippen, Haddam. It confirms what our previous colleagues have found. Our findings also said that where gaps were, where the educational culture of the school and between those of the students' cultural intelligences is wide, that the teacher skilled in connecting the curriculum to students' life worlds can have a large positive effect on academic and social outcomes of students, especially Aboriginal and diverse students, underserved by school previously. Home to school literacy schemes are most successful in our findings when teachers are skilled to connect the student funds of knowledge to the curriculum and encourage a systemic versions of practice. In the time that I have, I want to finish that we found several paradoxes, and I just want to conclude by showing you 3. The paradox one is that a crowded curriculum in a public school leads to less preparation time, and that forces teachers into teacher-centred instruction. And it also forces teachers into low-level teaching tasks, worksheet curriculums, and pedagogies of control, rather than sharing power with the student. Teachers told us that when they experienced this, that it had an accumulated effect, that the teacher found it difficult to share power with students. It stifled their pedagogical innovation for a super diverse learner. So the second paradox is teacher as subject, that teachers were frustrated by the image of teachers' work being dominated by reaffirmed curriculum guides and public examinations and standard teacher scripts. Individual teachers we interviewed wished to change the emphasis of teacher as examiner or judge or scrutinizer to one that is a knowledge co-constructor with their students. And the third paradox is student as competent subject. The teachers we interviewed highlighted that scripted pedagogy derived from narrow curriculum keeps the student as subject as docile and passive, and as a consumer of knowledge rather than those that are active. They were worried that these highly scripted pedagogies were turning off the learner's power, the power of the Aboriginal and diverse learner. And what we also found was there were high demand for culturally responsive pedagogies for super diverse learners. Our research also confirmed that cultural competency has failed, that the teacher cannot be competent to 100% in all of the cultures that are the super diverse cultures that are walking into class. And that this is possibly a part of the problem that cultural responsive pedagogies attempts to try and ameliorate. We also found that Aboriginal perspectives in the curriculum and anti-racist education and explicit instruction when used just as a sole pedagogy performed less strongly when compared to cultural responsive pedagogy. So, in conclusion, how do we support our leaders, our principals, and our teachers in responsive practices we know work to raise achievement, engagement, and disposition and reduce disparity? Well, the leaders that we spoke to, that they were supporting teachers as pedagogical leaders to study alternative practices inside their own school, and that they didn't rely on the guru that comes in to do professional learning communities, professional learning with their teachers, that wasn't addressed to the local challenges that the school was facing. That robust teacher inquiry using evidence focused on improving practice owned by teachers. If we are to fund access to public schooling and have most children fail, we have to come back to the question of whether we have the balance right in public school, of who's benefiting and who is not. If we are to understand the complexity of literacy and diversity, and especially if we want to maximise opportunities for it to be achieved, then we need to widen the focus from individual lone creator of literacy toward understanding of cultural responsive collectiveness, of co-constructed relationship between the leader of the school, the teacher, the learner, the parent, and literacy. We can only get through to cognition through belonging. My ultimate goal in this research has always been to navigate the codes of power through the lens of Indigenous critical pedagogy for a kind of reconceptualisation towards an inclusive dialogic cultural responsive gesture. I see cultural responsive pedagogy committing to the justice, cultural diversity, and fostering dialogue, connecting students' cultural and linguistic intelligences to the school. And I guess the main point that I want to leave you with today is we're attempting to make public schools, to make the transformation possible rather than despair convincing. And if I leave you with Raymond Williams, this one idea of the teacher, not only as the principal of schools, not only as host, but isn't that our role to make transformation possible rather than despair convincing? My kind friends, thank you very much.